There's been a lot of talk in the news recently about F1 changing up its race weekend and sprint race weekend formats. So I figured I would come up with my own F1 sprint format and see what the internet has to think about it. Now, Stefano Domenicali has been in the news recently talking about wanting to get rid of free practice in F1, and to be honest, I kind of see Stefano Domenicali's point with this. I don't think that 3 free practices is really needed because the engineers are so prepared now going into race weekends with all of the simulation data that they have. I also like the idea of having something fun on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, whereas right now it's really only Saturday and Sunday that matter, except for on those sprint weekends. And I think it would be great if some of this practice time could be given to the F2, F3, or even F1 Academy members in order to give them the chance to improve their skills, as they're the ones that need it much more than the F1 drivers. I also think that having less practice time might mean that more teams have setup issues on the cars, which could make some races a little bit more interesting. We saw this in 2022, where Red Bull actually lost on 2 of the 3 weekends that had sprints, and that was to Ferrari in Austria and to Mercedes in Brazil, which is something that they probably will need to fix for 2023. So my idea with the F1 sprint format is going to kind of play into some of these ideas that Domenicali has addressed. So the 2022 sprint format had on Friday a 1-hour FP1 session and then a standard Q1, Q2, Q3 qualifying to set the sprint grid. Now, with qualifying on Friday, I think this increases attendance at the track because it makes Fridays have a meaningful session. However, people at home who aren't able to attend in person, it causes some problems because the qualifying is on at a time that most people are at work. For me, it's on at 7 or 8 in the morning on most days, which is before I go to work, so I have to get through an entire workday staying off social media to not get spoiled to what happens in qualifying, and it can be a struggle. And then for others in Europe, it's probably on at like 3 or 4, which kind of similar idea, the end of their workday. But I do like, as I said before, that there is action on a Friday, and that adds a little bit more to the race weekend. Now on Saturday, there is a 1-hour FP2 session and then the sprint. And I have never understood why this FP2 session exists. It is under Parc Ferme conditions, so teams aren't able to make many changes to their cars. And it's just, yeah, why do we need this? Like, there is no point to it. And then we also have the fact that the sprint set the grid for the race on Sunday, which caused teams to not want to push too hard and compromise the race by crashing out in the sprint. So I think we really need to disconnect the sprint from the race. This is something that I think needs to happen. This is how they do it in F2 and F3. And yeah, I just don't think the order of that, the finishing order of the sprint should impact the race. And then of course on Sundays we have the race. This should not change. This is perfect. Now for 2023, the current kind of idea that's been floated out there is to have a similar Friday in which they have a 1-hour FP1 session and then have a Q1, Q2, and Q3 qualifying, but this qualifying to set the race grid instead of the sprint grid. I think this is good to do. However, we still have that same issue with having qualifying on a Friday. And then the current idea is to have Saturday, instead of that pointless FP2 session, have a Q1, Q2, Q3 qualifying, but this one to set the sprint grid. I like that they're changing it to the sprint being disconnected from setting the race grid because it allows more teams to push without compromising their race, apart from the fact that they would have to fix the car overnight. But I don't really like that they currently want to have the same qualifying format as normal to set the sprint grid. How much is this really going to change the grid order? There might be a few positions kind of at the 9-10 spot that might change a little bit, but like the top teams are always going to be the top teams, and so how much is the order really going to change between the two? And I love qualifying, but watching the same thing twice is kind of boring. So I really, really hope that they change this to a one-shot quali or some other form of qualifying format. If they disconnect the sprint from the race, there is a little bit more leeway with them to play with the format of it a little bit. And I think one-shot quali is a little bit more gimmicky, but I think since the sprint is giving out less points, I think it's okay to play with it in that way. I don't know if I would go as far as doing a reverse grid for the sprint. While I love it in F2 and F3, I think the point of F2 and F3 is to showcase the skills of the drivers, and so pushing the people that qualify on pole further back in the grid allows them to show their racecraft, and also gives other people who aren't as good at qualifying the chance to be up front in the race and show their skills in that respect. But I don't know if I like the reverse grid format for sprint weekends. But I think playing with the qualifying and going into a sprint race, I think is a little bit more interesting, and it still allows teams to make up positions if they lose them in this qualifying. And then of course on Sunday we have the race. Now, my sprint format. I have come up with a format that I have not seen talked about anywhere else. I've seen a lot of other YouTubers and content creators come up with their own formats, and they go pretty standard with it and keep it pretty similar to how it is now. And I want to see things change a little bit. I think you could go a little bit more wild with it. So here is my idea for the F1 sprint weekend. On the Friday, we still have the 1 hour FP1 session. I think this is necessary for engineers to set up the car, and without having the session, they are not able to correlate the data with the simulator to the real world conditions. This 1 hour FP1 session will be for every single race except the first race at Bahrain, and I will go into this later. This FP1 session, the purpose of it should be for the engineers to set up for the sprint, because I have the sprints happening on Fridays. And hear me out with this. F1 are moving to having a sprint at every race weekend. They do this in F2 and F3. They want to improve the entertainment value of their product, and having something Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and keeping it consistent across every race weekend will be beneficial to new fans coming in and understanding how the race weekend works. Now, for this first race at Bahrain, I don't think that free practice is needed because testing occurs in Bahrain. As long as this continues to be the case, I don't see why we need to have free practice sessions for that first race. So instead, in Bahrain, we have a one-shot qualifying session as the first session of the year. This could be chaotic, but I think it should be able to showcase the talent and skills of these F1 drivers to be able to go into a car that they are not super familiar with and put on a good qualifying lap right off the bat. I think that would be fascinating, and it'll really separate the sheep from the wolves. After this one-shot qualifying session, this sets the grid for the sprint, which goes on as normal on the Friday. But on every single race weekend after the one in Bahrain, rather than having a one-shot quali session, instead you set the grid order based on the final finishing positions from the previous sprint. So this makes it like a Tour de France format. So you could have a car crash out, and so the next sprint they start at the back. That's their punishment. You could have someone spin out and fall back. Then they have to, at the next sprint race, make their way back up. I think this keeps it fair, and I think this makes it very interesting, and it allows a little bit more of a shuffling of the order. This also means that the sprint doesn't impact the grid order of the race. I think this is how the sprint should be. This is how they do it in F2 and F3, as I mentioned before. And I think this will improve the racing within the sprint. Now, my reason for having the sprint like this on Friday is an idea that I've been playing with, that the sprint not be under Parc Ferme conditions. this could add a lot of strategy to race weekends because it could allow the teams to test out their setups that they can later change for the race that weekend. It adds an element of strategy in the terms of, should a team show all of their cards for how they're going to set up their cars for the weekend, or do they keep some of those cards in pocket and go for a little bit less aggressive setup for the sprint? But I think it's important that some cars are still randomly tested after the sprint to make sure that they comply with safety and technical regulations, because I think that is the whole point of Parc Ferme. And it's important that the cars do comply with the regulations within the sprint. However, I think allowing the teams to make changes after the sprint itself could be interesting. On Saturday, I would still have that 1 hour FP2 session, but since the sprint is not under Parc Ferme conditions, it would allow teams to make changes to their cars, so there would be a little bit more intrigue into that session about how they can change their car, correct any errors in setup that they might have encountered during the sprint, and then they can also do qualifying practice runs for the qualifying later that day. And I do think that having 2 practice sessions seems like a good balance between the one useful one that is kind of currently in the regulations versus the 3 that happen on a normal race weekend, which is too much. And then on the Saturday evening, you go into the standard Q1, Q2, Q3 format, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I love qualifying it as it is. Some weekends I actually find qualifying more enjoyable than the race itself, particularly in Monaco. And I think having qualifying then puts the cars into Parc Ferme after that qualifying, which doesn't impact the sprint. That is my idea for the Saturday. And then Sunday would go on as normal with the race, which is perfect as it is. Part of my reason for having the sprints like this is you could now do a separate sprint championship. With the sprints happening at every single race weekend, you could award reduced points for the top 8 for each individual sprint race. And then my idea is to have the total results after the final sprint in Abu Dhabi. The winner of that would win the sprint championship, and then the benefit of winning the sprint championship, or at least placing well in the sprint championship, is to have the points equivalent to a race win for the top 10 in the sprint championship be given to the drivers in the regular drivers championship. So basically, going into Abu Dhabi, you would have, in a sense, 2 opportunities to get 25 points, which I think could make things very interesting. I know in the past they used to award double points at Abu Dhabi, which people weren't a big fan of, but this at least gives intrigue into 2 separate races that happen at Abu Dhabi and could cause a lot of interesting scenarios for how drivers could win championships or constructors could win championships. And it also makes it important for teams to do well in the sprints all year. And yeah, I just think that could be really, really interesting. And so that's my idea for the sprint championship. So let me know what you think in the comments down below, and like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this content. I went a little bit out of left field with this one, but I just got really bored one day and just started thinking about how I would do the sprint format, and I think this is an interesting way to do it. I really like the idea of doing a Tour de France with the sprints. I think that could be very, very interesting, and it's almost as equivalent to doing like a reverse grid. You'll have a lot more times where there's a car coming up from the back, and you don't want to crash in the race before Monaco, because then if you're having to do the sprint race from the back in Monaco, you're completely screwed for that race. So there's a lot of like strategy to it as well. So I don't know, I just think it's a really fun idea. So I really hope that they get creative with it. I think I like where they're thinking of going with the 2023 sprint format. I think just a few more little tweaks and it could be perfect. Yeah. See you guys next week for another video.